It's great to fuck up. I think you have to fuck up. The job of most managers and leaders is to make decisions. As a manager, if you make 55% of good decisions, you're a really good manager. If you make 60%, you're exceptional. But that means 40% of your decisions will be wrong. I was listening to a podcast with Zuckerberg, and he says, failing is one of macro competencies. That's so true. The job is not to be right. The job is to make decisions. If you keep making the same decision wrong multiple times, then that's a problem. And then you need to have a conversation.
Steph, this is such a special episode for me to do. We were talking downstairs and I was saying, I've been hearing about your operational excellence for years from Fred Destin. So thank you so much for joining me.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me. I mean, I've known you for a long time. It's still a surprise to be here today. First, it's a great honor. If I'm not sure I'm worthy, and no, it's very exciting. So thank you.
Well, I so appreciate that. But I was obviously, doing my work before the show on you, and the thing I wanted to start on is, how did you make your first foray into the world of startups? What was that entry point?
I wrote my final paper at university with a professor who founded the first commercial CD-ROM company in Europe. So he had seen in the US a product called Disclosure, which was a business database for US companies. And the CD-ROM at the time was revolutionary because, you couldn't store that much data on a floppy disk, right? It was a huge revolution. And so he built that company he bootstrapped it. And it became incredibly successful. It's a company that was called Bureau van Dijk, which was sold to Moody's for more than 3 billion euros a few years ago. And so he hired me because he thought, I sounded like a good sales guy. And then he sent me, cold calling all over the world on banks to try to sell them the software and the data. And so I started with Northern Europe. I went to Russia and Eastern Europe in 91. I went to South America, Colombia during the narcos. I went all over the world for 4 years.
With
I was living
as well.
with CD-ROMs, and so I would leave the CD on trial. So I had to. I was carrying CD-ROM readers. I would open the computers. At the time, they were 80 or XT computers. I would install a card inside the computer. I had a vacuum cleaner with me because these were all computers. They were incredibly dusty. So you had to clean them up before you could install the card. I basically, had my suitcase, my CD-ROM drives, and I went all over the place for 5 years.
I love this. I'm just picturing kind of narco wars in Colombia and the CD-ROMs coming around. It's so hard for me to ask questions like this next one, but I have to. It's just like 8 years at King is such an incredible time at such an incredible company. If you think about one or two of the most non-obvious lessons from that time, what do you think one or two of the most non-obvious lessons from that time are that really impacted how you think?
I mean, the first one is trust the data, not your intuition. King was always pretty data-driven, but it was an incredibly data-rich environment. I mean, the beauty of free-to-play on Facebook and later on mobile is that it provides you, faster and a higher quantity of data than almost any other business. And very often we had product intuition in terms of features or whatever, where the team would think, okay, this is what we need to change, and the data would give you a completely different answer. And I think it's been a great lesson in humility for product people. You have to be ready to be wrong. You have to, read carefully the data and act upon it. I think that's one thing that's really important. And the other insight is, the Swedish model, which of I would say labor relations is fantastic. I mean, you build incredibly resilient companies. So it's a bit of a shock when you get there because you have, these very generous, parental leave policies where both parents can leave for 6 months, and you have anybody can take a sabbatical at any time for, another 3 months, and then they all take their holidays at the same time for 5 or 6 weeks. They vanish for the Swedish summer from midsummer to early August, and then as you arrive there as a foreign executive, you wonder how you're going to be able to operate a business with that.
But I've got heart palpitations listening to Steph.
But then you have to plan around it, and which they do, and then essentially you create all these backup and support systems and labor mobility. The company you have then is much more robust and resilient to shocks, right? Because there is, you have essentially they have very high level of cooperation. The level of skills is very high. They're interchangeable. And we had that shock coming in, and then when we sold the company to Activision Blizzard, they had that shock coming in as well.
I have to ask some follow-ups there. When you say about kind of data over intuition, can you take me to like the biggest example for you where data proved something that intuition didn't suggest?
I mean, let me give you an example. We came up with a feature in Candy Crush, which was, incredibly good at monetization to the point where it made us uncomfortable. And so what we did was we essentially capped the feature. It was, at King we had a number of rules. We were very privileged in the sense that we had a huge number of players. So at the peak we had 540 million players, and we had a huge number of spenders. We had 7 or 8 million spenders. And so we could afford to have players who would spend a very low amount of money in the game and still create a huge business. So we were not reliant on very high spenders. And so I think we were very careful to make sure that, we would not, essentially vulnerable people spending too much money on the title and putting themselves in challenging situations. And one way of doing that was to cap the amount of money that you can spend in the title. And when we would see high spending, we actually would reach out to the players and we would ask them if they were aware of what they were doing, and to make sure it was not one of the kids who was using one of the parents' credit card does that not
go against, bluntly, the efficiency of how most gaming companies monetize, which is like actually large whales provide 80% of the monetization?
Look, some of the other gaming companies might behave that way. I don't know the numbers, and I'm sure they have some guardrails. King has roots in the indie gaming community, if you like. Many of our employees in the original Stockholm studio and many other studios care deeply about the player experience and really want to do something good, right? And provide a magical experience to the players. And hence, it was very important to be consistent ethically with these principles, so that we could drive employee engagement and people would be proud to work with King and proud to provide that experience to the players.
Speaking of people being proud to work with King, you mentioned also kind of the Swedish culture there. Do you think you can use that culture in other countries? Like, do you think it carries over, or do you think it's only the magic source of Sweden, the Swedish people?
I see no reason why you cannot bring over. It's not only the culture; it's just the model of labor relations. To a large extent, they take the drama out of it, and they make beautiful products. There are so many exceptional Swedish companies, and they're a bit like the Japanese. They have that incredible sense of design. They're highly cooperative, and they just design a working system which basically lets them live, pretty normal lives and have families and take good care of their families and themselves, right? And I think that's a model for, the rest of us.
We're going to discuss kind of building efficient systems, but my mother's favorite question in a show is actually the question of, if we're all a function of our histories and our pasts, and we all are shaped by our parents in some ways, what do you think you're running from, Steph?
That's a very good question. Well, for a long time, I was running away from them, probably from my father. I had a very difficult relationship with him. I left home before I finished school. And so, I think I never had somehow, his approval, or I never had, recognition from him. And so I basically left that behind and went to build a career and a life somewhere else, which is, the UK much later, right? I have 3 kids who are fantastic. And then there was basically a speech at school by, a very famous child psychologist called Stephen Biddulph. And what he was saying is, if you don't have a good relationship with your dad, how can you expect to have a good relationship with your sons? And what you need to do is, basically, if you want to fix that, is to go and sit down with your dad and make peace with him. I hadn't been at war with him or whatever, but I hadn't had that conversation. And so I went to sit down with my dad, probably 15 years ago, And that's the hardest thing I've done. I wouldn't say in my life, but close, right? And basically, I took him to lunch, and we had a proper chat, and it's changed a lot of things. Right?
Can I ask, has that relationship changed how you parent your 3 children?
Well, I assume so, but I haven't seen what it would have been if I had not, sat down with him and had that conversation.
Yeah, no, I totally get you. Right, we're going to get into from very deep there, which I love, but to the making of Europe's greatest exec, because I spoke to Fred before, and he actually changed that statement to one of the most effective execs in the world. He said, Europe's not enough. And so I said, great, okay. And I wanted to start with high performance. When we think about building machines and models, when I say the words high performance to you, what does that mean?
Talking about leaders, I use the way I, evaluate, the performance of the leadership team is I look across 4 dimensions. The first one is the operating or the financial performance of their function. So, have they beaten their numbers essentially? The second one is organizational maturity. So have they build a great team? So, do they have, strong people in all the key functions, and are they challenging them? Have they built, great processes? Do they have great succession in place? The third dimension is, to what extent do they contribute to the corporate agenda? Because if you're a leader, you have 2 hats, right? You have your functional or your operational hat, and you have a second hat, which is the collective hat of the collective leadership team. And then the last one is where they stand on their leadership journey and personal. And so, are they a role model? Are they a thought leader? Are they being sought after by other people in the organization? How are they developing themselves? And so I look across these 4 dimensions to assess leadership performance.
Can I ask, where do you find most people fall down? Where do most people struggle when you work with founding teams today? Among those 4, where is the most common failure point?
With founders, in the early days, I don't think that grid would be applicable because there's so much uncertainty. And so, it's important to set targets early, but you need to navigate much more tactically in the early days and the early years of building a company. I think the framework applies better to professional executives and managers than to founders. You will find the founders spiking exceptionally on some of these and maybe less on some others. And that's probably okay. And they should hire a great team, next to them to do the rest. I think for them, it's, a lot of it is going to be about the ability to put a fantastic team together and then show them the way, as opposed to getting high marks on all of these dimensions.
And one thing I find hard, which is you've worked with the best execs in the world, you've worked with the best founders in the world, both investor-wise and operationally within teams. And then you meet companies and young founders. And naturally, they're young founders, and what matters is not where they are, but their rate of development, how fast they're learning, how fast they're growing. It's hard because you automatically compare the greats that you work with, your Sonas at Dream Games, to everyone else you're meeting. And naturally, there is a progression pathway to there. Sona 5 years ago was probably different. How do you think about analyzing rate of development of founders?
Yeah, well, first, many of them are not young in the young sense, right? If you look at the average age of company founders, and I think there was a stat in the US that successful founders of successful software companies in the US are in the early 40s. And so, very often we work with founding teams who are, from late 20s and 30s, sometimes to the early 40s. So obviously you apply a slightly different evaluation grid at that stage, but it's really what drives them. What is really their objective? Do they want to build something that's going to change the world? Are they self-aware? Are they vulnerable? Great leadership, it's self-awareness and vulnerability as well. And those are qualities you don't need to be older to have these qualities, right? They're on show early.
I nailed the vulnerability from a very early start.
Yeah. And do we feel they will be able to build a great team? Are they going to be? And that's something you can see reasonably quickly. Actually, you just look around them. If they already brought a couple of people with them, and you get a sense for, okay, do we believe that some of the top execs will want to work with them and go through the journey.
We were talking downstairs actually about relationships and their impact on being a most effective exec and the kind of operator that you can be. When you think about kind of one or two lessons, and this was from Fred, but one or two lessons or secrets in being the most effective and efficient exec, what would you say those are if you were to summarize what has been now a 15 or so career?
I think you need to do the work. I think you are at the service of your team, and that means that that you should not be a consumer of their time, but you should be a multiplier of their time and their effort. That means that before you meet with them, if there is material, you read the material. If you have questions, you send them the questions, and you come prepared to the meeting, and you focus on the couple of issues that really matter. And if you apply that discipline to yourself, you will drive it down through the organization, and you will have a much more effective and efficient organization. So it's role modeling.
Can I ask a weird one? But often people say you should never ask someone to do what you're not willing to do. And that's kind of quite an often said statement. And I go, well, that's ridiculous. Like, as an exec, you probably shouldn't go through tagging files. Of course, you're kind of willing to do it, but it's just not an efficient thing to do. Do you agree with that? You shouldn't do what you're not willing to do?
Well, I think you shouldn't ask people to do what you haven't been willing to do at some point in your career. I mean, obviously, as things evolve, the highest impact you might have for your shareholders and your company and your team might not be, some of the most mundane tasks. But, if you were never ready to do them at some point in your career, that's probably not something you should be asking. Yes.
Yeah. Now, when we spoke before, you gave me some kind of tips and pointers as to where we should take discussion. There were many which were kind of teasers where I didn't really know where to go with them. Luckily, the first one I did, because you said 90% of scaling organizations is communication and decision making. If we break this down, what did you mean by this, and how does that realization change how you lead?
When you run a survey inside a company and you ask the company, is communication good, and are you happy with the level of communication? The answer is always no, and it gets worse as you scale, right? So there is never enough communication in a company, and if you aspire to be a leader, and it's even true in the public markets, you have to be ready to repeat yourself a lot, and that's good. It's perfectly okay. But that means you really need to design your organization in a way where you're going to have very thorough communication, both vertically and horizontally. So vertically, I think you want to communicate with your direct team, and then tell them that they have to cascade it all the way down. So they have to communicate with their teams and then the teams below, and they should communicate everything. Unless you tell them this you can't share, they should push down every little bit of information to the very bottom of the company, because that's how you drive engagement and trust.
Do you teach them how to communicate? Because it's not always obvious for people.
Well, you role model it in the sense that, if you have your staff meeting, at some point it's your turn, and, also you should only communicate what cannot be communicated in writing or through reporting earlier. When you run a digital organization, typically they're very data rich, and so we were designing and distributing these very detailed reports with which would go pretty much everywhere. And at King, everybody could access the data warehouse. And that was a deliberate choice, because that's driving engagement. That means I trust every employee to be responsible with the data. It's a very big decision to take when you decide to go public, because if you do that, that means the whole company will be insiders, and they can only trade within trading windows. And so you have to make that decision on whether you want to treat your employees as adults, and they will be responsible with essentially the data and the power you share with them, or whether, you want to allow them to trade any day of the week. We had that discussion, I think, actually with Meta. I mean, we were very lucky. We spent time with Mark Zuckerberg before we went public. It was like a year after his IPO, and he shared these lessons about his IPO, which was very challenging, right? His stock went down 50% after the IPO. And I think that's one of the insights we took from that discussion.
What are the biggest ways that communication breaks down? What are the most striking?
It's when trust breaks down, because, horizontal communication is also very important. So when you get your staff together, it's all about sharing information or sharing challenges, and also getting feedback from the rest of the team that might help you in solving your challenges. And you can only do that in a trusted environment. And so when at some point, as you scale, politics starts to enter the organization, where you might have leaders who do not have the right fit, or who might have been imposed or whatever. Suddenly you lose the congenial nature of the meeting and the discussion around the table, and you have a communication breakdown.
Can I ask, do you trust people from day one and it's there to be lost? Or do you say, you know what, we're starting the relationship and it's yours to be gained?
I mean, I think you will definitely give them the benefit of the doubt if you had a thorough recruitment process. And you'll be very transparent, and you will share with them as much information and as with any other member of the team, in terms of trusting them with the ability to make the right decision and execute. That trust will be earned over time.
When trust is lost, say someone does something and it doesn't work out, and whatever reason, say when trust is lost, is there a step to regain it? Is the communication with them? But I find trust once lost is very difficult to regain.
That's a personal failure of mine. I have a hard time trusting after something goes wrong, but I can get there. But it's hard. I agree with you. And but I've been I have a number of specific examples where I managed to rebuild trust afterwards, and somewhere basically there was always a stain that could never be removed. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree. I'm sorry, I am doubling down on this, but when you think about like goal setting, how do you think about effective goal setting today?
It will depend on the function. Obviously, Google has made the fact that you shouldn't. You should set goals for engineering teams that should never be fully achieved, because that's a way for them to be agile and stretch themselves. But also you want to make sure they don't feel like they're failing. So if they have goals that cannot be fully achieved, but they don't reach them and it's a failure, that doesn't work. I think that's fantastic. And
I'm never sure. Do you want them to feel? Because I want them to feel enough pain of not hitting a goal.
So they should be stretched, but what's very important is for teams to set their own goals, because that's how they're going to be engaged, and that's how they will stretch themselves. But if you feel these goals are not stretching enough, then you should challenge them. It's very different with some other functions, such as finance or legal, where actually you need to meet the goals 100%. Your accounts have to be closed on time. If you're a public company and you need to close your accounts,
we're 70% of the way there.
It's got to be there. So you can't generalize. It's function specific.
What do you think? You work with many founders obviously today, and when you see communication break down, what's the commonalities in the mistakes that they make around communication?
I mean, they're not mistakes. For some of them, it takes time to find the right balance. Either they over-communicate, so they will share, probably too much data and operational data with investors and board members with good intentions, because they might believe that that's what we expect, or they might believe we will help with some of that operational detail. Some other founders want to keep boards and investors at a distance, and sometimes there's information retention that goes beyond what makes an investor and a board member effective, and then you need to sit down and have a pretty direct conversation. That's not the deal, right? I mean, when you invest in a company, it's a marriage. It's going to last. If it's early stage, it's going to last for a very long time, and you need some level of transparency. If that transparency isn't there, we're not going to be effective, and we were probably not the right investor for that founder.
Steph, we have hundreds of thousands of founders that listen, and I think they struggle with this a lot, which is like, how much information do I share with my wider investor base? Obviously, boards, you have to share board materials and board packs, and a lot involved with that. But for investor updates, how do you advise founders on how much to share in terms of information and data?
Again, I'm not sure there is an absolute rule. You shouldn't share, obviously, anything that could competitively expose you. I think we're living through very different times today, where it's obviously much more challenging. There are some very strong headwinds. I think the information you wanna share with your investors, you have to be truthful in terms of how the company and the team is performing, but you also don't want to leak into the market information that could be detrimental to your ability to fundraise or to do a transaction or to secure new clients, because some clients might ask about the potential longevity of your company if you are challenged from a financial standpoint.
Can I ask, from a communication standpoint, when you reflect on your own, what are the biggest communication mistakes that you've made?
They typically would be decisions made too fast and communicated too fast. I think communication takes work, and you need, it takes structure. Communication is about telling a story, and telling a story, it takes time to build, the right narrative and the right structure and find the right words. In my experience, I made communication mistakes when I communicated before I was ready, and typically they would be, saying something in front of somebody which was not the right thing to say, and then I have no problem to go and apologize. I mean, I can say sorry.
Can you help me with that? Because I always think when someone does something and you're providing feedback and communicating back to them, it's best done in real time. Steph just did this, let's discuss it now. And as you said, sometimes things need a little bit more thought.
You can be very spontaneous with praise. You want to be, very systematic with it. When you see something that's great, you absolutely have to call it. But at the same time, you want to be sparse, because otherwise it loses quite a bit of its value. And employees will, everybody will know that if you are sparse with your praise, when you get it, they will value it immensely. I think for, more challenging feedback, you need to pick your time, and you need, but it's also highly valued if you have the right team members. You just need to box it in a way where you say, hey, by the way, maybe you could have done this differently. You could have, and give an example and say, but no problem, and move on. And you will deliver that within 2 minutes or 3 minutes. Not make a beef out of it. Move on, and it's highly valued by the team.
I love something you said to me before, which is the uncomfortable power of almost radical transparency. What does the uncomfortable power of almost radical transparency mean?
So I work with a fantastic company and two fantastic entrepreneurs, and one of their principles has been to apply radical transparency to the way they have founded and they've built their company, and they mean it. So everything is totally transparent, from every conversation at every level in the organization with everybody to compensation. Initially, all the employees and the board members and the investors and the stakeholders would receive that weekly newsletter where everything was. And it's incredibly powerful. So what works really well is, in terms of, for example, compensation discussions, which, and negotiations, that can take a lot of time and create a lot of tension. There's no room for negotiation, because it's all, they have these that grid, which is public, and the whole system is completely transparent, and there's no room for negotiation. So it cuts these discussions short. The company, the employees, back to the trust point, they know pretty much everything. So the trust is extremely high. The engagement is extremely high. You don't need to spend much time communicating beyond that, because all the information is already there. And so that makes the company extremely efficient in terms of shipping, and also in terms of alignment. They all know what the objectives are for everybody, and they're all running towards that objective. I was uncomfortable a couple of times when, I think when you have the names of people who are being recruited that are shared internally, I think that's I think you need a lot of trust in your employees to be really careful with that, because that can be damaging to the careers of some individuals. Or if you have any discussions about transactions or personal matters, and I think over time they've slightly adapted. It's become there are a couple of things that now they might not disclose.
I don't think companies should be transparent on fundraising.
I tend to agree with you. I think they've managed to be incredibly successful at fundraising while being transparent many times. I think they might be a little less transparent today.
In terms of transparency, I honestly find that you can't ever be 100% transparent. When you look at the model that you've seen work most effectively, how does that look on the stage? Is it 50%, 0, 100%?
Really, the more transparent, the better. I mean, that company is the extreme example, and I think it's and there's a bunch of other things they're doing which make it incredibly powerful. At King, we try to be as again with that data point, we try to be as transparent as we could. With the scaling, when you have thousands of employees, it's really hard. You spend a lot of time, communicating and trying to retain the trust and the culture. And so, the leadership team was spending a lot of time on planes when we had, 7 studios and a bunch of locations. And we would go around and walk and spend time with the teams. And, whenever we would go, there would be a brown bag lunch and people could do Q&A. And so we were not in a room locked in meetings for the whole day. We tried to be really accessible and to try to have, off-the-cuff conversations left and right, because that's how you retain trust and engagement in the company. And the same is true of, the data. The more transparent you are about the data and about the strategy, about what you do, the higher the engagement in your company.
Steph, how do you give feedback? Data leads feedback and data leads that discussion. How do you give effective feedback as a leader today? And what have been some big lessons for you on how to do it right and how not to do it?
There's an ample body of literature on this, but always start with the good stuff, positive feedback to start with. And then there are always a couple of items that can be developed further. And for those, you have to be very specific and have an example ready. So if you say, well, I think you could do this differently or you can improve this, and let me give you an example of what you've done, and here's how you could have done it differently. If you don't have that second part, feedback is useless because they cannot action it. And it's actually very toxic, right? It creates a negative loop. If there's an issue, make sure you are prepared and you have that example and you have a way to improve it that you can share before you give that feedback.
Do you think teams have gotten a bit soft? And what I mean by that is the shit sandwich, all these nice ways to mollycoddle, all of these kind of slightly more gentle ways of saying, hey, you know what, Steph, we fucked up here and it shouldn't happen again. And this is how it shouldn't happen. And you can walk people through in a nice way. But, 20 years ago, the world was a lot more blunt.
Well, I think, it's great to fuck up. I think you have to fuck up. The job of, most managers and leaders is to make decisions. As a manager, if you make 55% of good decisions, you're a really good manager. If you make 60%, you're exceptional. But that means 40% of your decisions will be wrong. And so I was listening to a podcast with Zuckerberg, and he says, failing is one of my core competencies, which is fantastic. That's so true. So the job is not to be right. The job is to make decisions. And of course, you're going to get a bunch of decisions wrong. And there is no negative feedback about that. If you keep making the same decision wrong multiple times, then that's a problem. And then you need to have a conversation.
How do you analyze your decision-making framework today? People have different frameworks. Jeff Bezos has the regret minimization and one-way and two-way door. How do you think about your own decision-making framework today?
Look at the data, consult widely. When you make a decision, if you have to syndicate it. And when you make a decision, stick with it. What is incredibly toxic in organizations, and I've seen that many times, is you make a decision and then you come back on it the next week and then the following week, and basically drives paralysis in your organization. Go through due process, and if it takes time, take the time. But once you make it, stick with it. I think that's very important. And then I have a bias for execution. Once a decision is made, execute it immediately. The faster, the better. Okay,
let's just do that. Stick with it. What if it's potentially wrong?
Of course, you will have exceptions, right? But the if you followed due process and you looked at the data and you consulted widely, probably 95% of your decisions will be the decisions you should have made. And if indeed there are new facts that come to light, and you change your mind, that's okay. That's something you can do. But you need new facts. When facts change, I change my mind. Sure. If there are no new facts and you change your mind on a whim, then that kind of behavior will cascade down the organization and you will paralyze it. You can't do that.
You mentioned once that decision is made, speed of execution being so important. Talk to me about speed of execution today within companies and why I think it's the number one difference between those that achieve product market fit and those that don't. Bluntly, just how fast you have at bats, I call it, like how many shots you take.
And it's part of sense of urgency, which is another common theme that we've heard about many times on the podcast. But if you make a decision, just go and do it as soon as you're out of the door, pretty much. And speed of iteration is very important, especially in digital businesses. And to your earlier point, I've seen companies where they take 6 weeks or 8 weeks or 10 weeks basically to come up with a minor iteration to a pretty minor feature, and that's just way too slow. In this day and age, you need to really come out hopefully within days with a new feature and test it and see if it works or not, and iterate again and move on again and go really fast. You just can't afford to have these cycles in months anymore.
Can I ask, when you think about the decisions you've made, what do you think is one of the biggest decisions you've made that changed the way that you think about decision making?
One of the things we had at King was we required unanimity for recruitment. We put in place again, a well-documented recruitment process where we wanted 6 interviews. You needed a cross-functional interviewer, an executive sponsor, and unanimity. And after a lot of lobbying, after 5 or 6 years, because we were not meeting our recruitment targets, I agreed to soften the criterion, and that if one of the interviewers was neutral, we could still proceed with the hire. And then what happened is, actually, when one of the interviewers was negative, the other 5 would lobby him to change his rating and to go to neutral, and they could proceed with the hire. And we made a number of wrong hires. And there is nothing more important when you scale than recruitment and cultural fit. And if there is no doubt, I think one of your guests said, I think that's Frank Slotman, I completely agree with him. There's much more downside making the wrong hire than not bringing in the right person, because that person, if you scale fast, will be recruiting himself within a few weeks. And then you will, create pockets of people who are not culturally aligned with the organization. And before you know it, in a matter of, months, suddenly you have part of your organization. It might be a studio, or, it might be a function in somewhere which doesn't really fit anymore. And that's happened a number of times. And then it takes, months or sometimes years to fix this thing. I mean, it's not something you can fix overnight. Because typically those are important locations and important functions, and they misalign with the rest of the business, and your company will not operate well as long as that's the case.
A lesson that I have on management is you never stop worrying. And the reason I say that is because with the best people you worry will leave. The worst people you worry you should fire today. And the middle people you worry are actually good enough. Would you agree with that?
In what we do in early stage and growth, for most people, there's a cycle, in the scaling, and so there will be a good fit between their skill set and the company for a while. And it might be a few years, 2, 3, 4 years, because they have a certain level of risk appetite, and because they like a less structured organization, or more structured, less process, more process. And then at some point it's not the right organization for them anymore, and you need to have grown-up conversations, and they need to find something where they can be very successful and where there's a better fit. Without that, it's not there's nobody has failed. It's just the way things are, and I think organizations and people should be honest about it. When you scale very fast, it's very hard. It can be very hard because if you think about our company, we went from 100 employees to 2,400 employees in 3 years, and so you have these cohorts. So at the peak, we were hiring 100 employees a month, and so the people who joined, obviously at the start of the journey, they had a very high risk appetite. They had very horizontal skills. They could do many different things, and they could operate in a not very organized company. But then as you get closer, suddenly the company becomes much larger, very profitable. We made almost $1 billion of EBITDA the year before IPO, and you're running to IPO, and you need to specialize. So you bring people in functions who have very deep specialized expertise as opposed to horizontal skills. They're less risk averse. You need to compensate. They look for a different compensation mix, maybe less equity, more cash, and they want to work in a more organized environment where you have a set of processes and you have a set of rules, and so you have these cohorts of people who've entered your company, basically within 3 years, who are totally different, and you need to retain a single cemented culture that wraps around all of them. And that's a huge challenge. So I think we've tried to keep that culture, and I think we had a fantastic culture in the company for a very long time, and I'm sure it's still great. But you have to evolve your values. For example, your values cannot stay static. So every year you have to revisit whether the values you had for the company are still the right values. And so to your point, I think there's a natural cycle of attrition. I think that is the right thing for both the company and the employees. And it's not about failing or underperforming. It's just that it's not the right place for them anymore.
Can I ask, what do you think is a good value? I know it seems stupid, but I'm just thinking about kind of if I would say values of my companies. I haven't set values, Steph. Maybe I should have done.
No. Look, values is the behaviors you would expect, the leadership and the employees to abide by when they are in the company environment. And so what we used, and actually what I would be using if I had another company, is we try to balance them. So, for example, one of the values was supportive but demanding, right? Because we were a hugely caring company. So the founding team was fantastic, and we had these shared values, and all of us were really deeply caring about people and about the employees, and so we were very supportive. But also, we wanted people to stay focused and to deliver, and we were basically running the biggest game in the world, and we had the biggest network of players, and we had a responsibility towards these players, and so we were going to be demanding with ourselves and with our employees to keep delivering outstanding entertainment to our player base.
I had Akin on the show, and he said that mission statements are largely bullshit, and he mentioned Facebook, which is obviously kind of tools for communities, and it's a very kind of long-winded and superfluous mission statement. And he basically said, which Facebook employee is really kind of empowered by that statement, and actually they're largely corporate BS. Do you think mission statements have their place and are good?
Again, if you scale to a large company and it becomes a public company and you have multiple business units, it can get really difficult to put together a crisp mission statement. When you're early stage, it should be pretty straightforward to know what you stand for. And actually, I think if you can't articulate a mission statement as a founder when you're at seed or Series A stage, I have a question mark about whether you know where you're going and what value you're going to be delivering to your clients. I think the early mission statement at King was, it was about bringing moments of magic. And I think that's exactly what we were doing. We were bringing moments of magic. It was pretty straightforward. That was our raison d'être. That was, over time, it gets harder.
Yeah. I think kind of one way to scale culture is also by having diverse teams. And before we move into the myth of Sisyphus, which I'm terrified about how to do that well, but tell me, what are the biggest lessons on building diverse teams and the myth of Sisyphus?
Yeah, okay. I mean, it's the challenge of our generation. It's obvious that diverse teams, over time, it's perform better. It's not only the right thing to do, it's a much better thing to do, by the shareholders and by the employees and by all stakeholders. It's very hard because, especially in technology companies, the recruiting pool, for example, for engineers and all STEM subjects is not equal from a gender standpoint. And here I'm talking about, gender diversity as opposed to, other types of diversity. What I was referring to is the myth of Sisyphus. So Sisyphus is this guy who keeps, pushing a rock up a hill, and then the rock keeps falling, and he has to start again from the bottom of the hill and push it up again and again and again. So if you look at making your leadership team more diverse from a gender diversity standpoint, you can bring external hires, and there are very few of them. So, a good rule is 1/3 external, 2/3 internal. And then you develop your female employees, and you really overinvest to develop them into managers and to leaders, and you have a set of programs around that just to make sure that we're going to get to that diversity at the top. But then what happens is, because there is such a scarcity, is very often, once you promote them to an executive level, be it VP or CXO, you lose them within weeks. And so it happened to us multiple times, where we made that investment over years of, bringing up and developing great female leaders. And then when they got to that leadership level where, we wanted them really to blossom and join the collective leadership and lead the company, they would be snatched very quickly. And so we had to start again and again and again. Hence the Sisyphus analogy.
Can I be blunt? Is that not your fault? Like, is that not a lack of loyalty there? For, we see some incredible people like your, Naomi's at Meta's, or your, Cheryl's, who was there for many, many years, is two great examples just from Meta, where I'm sure they have every single company in the world wanting to poach them, but the loyalty that Zuck inspired in them, and maybe the share price and, aligned worth, but like the loyalty they had meant they stayed. Is that not up to the leader to create that loyalty?
Well, look, it's on us, right? Clearly we failed. There's something that was missing. If they felt that it was the right thing for them at that point to go somewhere else, there was something missing, and we failed to bring it.
How do you know when to pay up for a candidate versus not pay up for a candidate? I'm always hiring, both investment team, media company wise. People want a lot of money. How do you determine whether to pay up or not pay up? And what would your advice to me be on that one?
As you scale, at some point you have compensation frameworks, and it becomes very difficult actually to go outside these frameworks for a bunch of reasons. If it's for an individual contributor, that's easier. If it's for managers or leaders who will fit within the existing organizational structure, there are ways you can structure things by buying out maybe some of the existing equity, or having one-off sign-off bonuses or special retention bonuses. But the reality is that you're going to need to have some consistency. And especially once you're public, basically, a lot of that data is going to be shared with your institutional investors, and they will actually pay attention. That's one of the things where you have to do a lot of work actually before going public, is your compensation policies. Hopefully, the market is clearing a bit, and we're going to a place where, the balance between talent and organizations goes back to something which is closer to the middle, as opposed to being very much a seller market to the advantage of the individual, which has been the case for the last few years.
You mentioned going public there, and you have done many times. I spoke to JC Adalan before the show, and he said, ask Steph the question of, how do you advise founders on when to sell?
I would never advise a founder on when to sell. I think, it's a decision to be made by the founder. And if he asks my opinion, then I will tell him what I think. Most of the large majority will come to the right decision themselves. There are some instances where it's not the case, and then you want to give a little nudge. I mean, it's obviously a very relevant question for King. We sold at a very low multiple. We sold a company at 5.9, so about $6 billion with, and there was 1.3 billion of cash on the balance sheet when we sold. So the effective multiple was maybe 5 or 6 times EBITDA. And today, the effective multiple on King inside Activision is probably 15 or 18 times EBITDA. So it was a huge value arbitrage. But at the same time, it was the right thing to sell at that time, because we had institutional investors who had been in the company for more than 10 years. That it was important to generate liquidity for them, and we couldn't do it through the stock market.
Do you think it is important to generate liquidity for them? You're an investor now. We both know that actually we have long time horizons. We actually have LP bases, if you're bluntly in the fortunate position to have great institutions in you, where you can say, hey, this asset's taking longer, I want a 2-year extension to the fund period. And then we enjoy value appreciation.
Investment funds have a lifetime. It's typically 10 years, and there can be extensions. But so they will invest with you for 8 or 10 years when they invest early stage. And I think you know what you get into when you sign up with them. You need to figure out a way of basically finding liquidity and distributing that liquidity to the institutional investors. One way of doing this is to go public, and then for the investors to be able to sell their shares. It was very difficult to do that with King, because we were trading below our IPO price, and because our largest institutional investor had 40% of the shares, and it was, they just couldn't sell it down, and selling it down, it would have driven the share price, further below, and it would have taken ages. So basically selling to Activision was a way of delivering against that objective, and it was the right thing to do.
So you gave me Sisyphus, and then you gave me Seneca and the elixir of luck. I was looking at this at midnight over the weekend going, what on earth am I going to do with these? Yeah. So what does Seneca and the elixir of luck mean?
Yeah, look, luck is important in business. Right? Yeah. You have that saying that, when you asked Napoleon how he picked his generals, he said, I picked them lucky. And, I was a beneficiary of that. I had a very lucky timing when I joined King, because I joined right before the launch of the first successful Facebook title. It's a lot easier to ride a wave of that sort, as opposed to going through some of the very challenging times they had before. But what Seneca said, going back to the Greeks, is that luck is a combination of opportunity and preparedness, and you have to be prepared. And so when you're prepared, the opportunity might knock on your door, and then you can seize that opportunity. And so the only thing that you can do as a professional, and the most important thing, is to prepare yourself for the opportunity. And so as you think about your personal development, you should focus on, accumulating skills and knowledge and network, so that if and when the opportunity presents itself, you can seize it and you can execute against it. And that's what I was trying to say. And sometimes it takes a long time. I had a dry patch. I mean, for 10 years, I was pretty much in the desert, right?
Really? When was
Between 2001, which was my first large exit, large-ish. I was working with a company called ENBA, so ENBA PLC, which was an internet bank. It was the biggest startup of the European bubble. We raised 250 million, and we merged it with the internet bank of Telefónica and BBV in Spain for 2.4 billion, front page of the Financial Times. For a bunch of reasons, that deal was never completed. It was blocked by the Spanish regulator. And so we initiated litigation. We ended up with a settlement with several hundred million euros. Our investors, made good returns. The management got some money, but we had to basically sell our customers and our deposits and close down our operations. Relative financial success, not industrial success. But after that, it was really hard to land in Europe. I mean, in the US, if you have failed as an executive after building a huge startup, they will give you a second and a third chance. At that time, Europe was not like that. It's been a really long struggle.
What did you tell yourself in that time?
I had confidence in my abilities. I think I had, performed quite strongly earlier. I had done 2 companies before, and actually, both of these companies went on to become unicorns, even if that internet bank was only a unicorn for a few months before the completion. I couldn't find an opportunity, and so it was quite a challenging and stressful time. And then when another opportunity presented itself, first I tried I was a founder, so I founded a payment company which didn't take off, so I pulled the plug after a year. That was hard too. And then I joined an enterprise software company which, got crushed by the great financial crisis in 2008. So, I worked from 2005 to 2009 for very little. And then, basically we had to restructure and sell that company for quite little. Yeah.
How do you think about your relationship to money today, Steph? I know it's a weird question, but a lot of people tie their worth to bluntly, how much money they have. I got a tax bill the other day. It was terrifying. And actually it really impacted a lot of my mindset of how I feel about my own value to my family, to my friends, how I identify myself. When you think about your relationship to money, how do you think about it?
I mean, it buys you freedom and spontaneity, but not happiness. I mean, it's, of course, it's life gets a lot easier when you are liquid, right?
Every LP feels
look, if you're raising a family in a large urban center like New York or London or a place like this, if you don't have access to some liquidity, life is hard. Yeah. I think obviously it's not a means to an end, right? It's like and you have to spend it. And you have to give it and you have to invest it, and it can certainly not stay basically stored in some vault somewhere, not doing anything, because otherwise what's the point? Because by spending it and investing it and buying art and doing all these things, basically you somehow give it back to the economy, and you give jobs to people, and you fund artists and creators, and you do something good with what you've built.
Speaking of kind of doing good with building and then also opportunity in Seneca, obviously you joined Index peak COVID, I think it was, Nina told me. What have been the single biggest surprises of becoming an investor?
Yeah, the shock is when you're an executive, especially in the digital business, you have a daily clock, right? The feedback loop is extremely fast. Yeah. So, every morning I would get 1,000 data points, with all the reporting. And then suddenly you go to a profession where the feedback loop is 8 to 10 years. And, it's 3,000 days. So you go from 1 day to 3,000 days. I mean, of course, you have milestones along the way. You have valuations if you fundraise, but we know how, that these are not
rigid,
reliable milestones, because, it might go in both directions. You have operational milestones. But the reality is, for an investor, is basically when do you return liquidity to your limited partners and your investors. And so you have that incredibly long time frame ahead of you. So that's been a major change. I think also I had not realized, how incredibly sophisticated and fluid, these investment firms, or specifically the one I work with, is from the outside. Because, I had been on the receiving end of, working with venture capitals and funds and private equity for many years. But once you're inside, you just realize that they like incredible high performance machines like race car, like an Italian race car. It's really, really very, very refined. That's been incredibly impressive, and I'm incredibly grateful
to
my partners.
When you say refined, what do you mean? Is that the decision-making process? Is that the tooling? What does that mean?
Yeah, it's the number of criteria that will come into making decisions, and the subtlety of many of those, and how they all come together in forming decisions. And especially because we have it's such a diverse firm. If you look at the partnership, we have an incredible richness in our partnership in terms of individual experiences and preferences and profile, and we make these collective decisions, and on the whole, it's been incredibly successful. So it's a very, very impressive machine.
What have been the biggest challenges?
I have to restrain my bias for action, because obviously, this is not about pulling the trigger on very often. It's taking a very, very long-term view of things, because, it's going to take 8 to 10 years before the outcome. And so you have to think really hard about whether you want to do something or not. It's been also finding the right balance in terms of working with founders. Obviously, I have a bunch of executive experience, which I can bring to the table, and which is part of, I guess, the attraction of potentially working with me. But that can also be overpowering, and I need to find with the founder basically where to set the dial. How can I be helpful but not too helpful, because they need to make their own way. And so I'm there to serve, right? I try to be a sounding board and always available, but it's their company. They're going to build them. They're going to run them. It's not mine to do.
A final one before we do a quick fire, but how did your time with King, how did that impact the type of founders that you like to work with, do you think?
At King, there's a very nice saying, which is, it's the mathematician meets the magician, right? And I think before I went to King, I could work with mathematicians, but since I've worked at King, I can also work with magicians. And so I have hopefully a great affinity for creatives, and I can work with creatives as well as with the business guys.
I love that mixture. I think they are unicorns, to be fair. Bringing the data and the creative is such a rare trait, I find, especially in marketers. I work a lot with CMOs, and the combination is challenging. I want to do a quick fire with you, Steph. So I say a short statement, you give me your immediate thoughts. Does that sound okay?
Yes.
So what single piece of content has had the most impact on you?
It's a very simple, small book called the Tao of Coaching, which I picked up in my years I spent a couple of years with McKinsey & Company, which is a great school. It's a great place to have been to. I borrowed that quote from a venture capitalist, actually. and it's a very human, very subtle way of discussing work relationship and how you can manage them, and how you can become a good coach. It's maybe 100 pages long. It's very easy to read, and I think it's very helpful.
What have you changed your mind on in the last 12 months?
Alcohol consumption. For the first time, we went pretty much dry in January, and it's been awesome. And we've, so I love wine, but I consume less of it and less frequently now than I used to.
And you feel much, much better?
Yeah, I feel great. I don't, I thought we were, my wife and I were quite surprised and thinking, actually, this is really nice and cool. We don't need another glass of wine, or we don't need a glass of wine.
I stopped drinking entirely.
Okay, fantastic.
And it was, I needed to, but it was the single best decision I've ever made. Tequila is not my friend. What's the kindest thing anyone's ever done for you?
When I left King, I received like tens of emails of people I hardly knew. Maybe some of them I'm not sure I had met, and they were saying, incredible things. And that's when you realize you've touched people's lives. I'm still shocked today I was not expecting that at all. You
can be CEO of any company. What company would you be CEO of, even for a day?
I think the coolest thing, it's probably SpaceX. You can play with rockets, you have all the satellites, you have all that stuff. I think in terms of doing something,
totally,
as a boy, who likes his toys, I think that's probably the coolest company out there.
What remains your biggest weakness?
Great sushi.
Great sushi?
Yes.
Really? Where's the best sushi in London?
I'm not going to tell you. That's a close-kept secret.
Have you been to Umu?
I've been to Umu. It's great sushi.
It's great sushi.
Yeah.
Tell me, how would you describe your biggest insecurity today?
I can't keep up with my wife in fitness. She crushes me.
What's the secret to a great marriage?
Love the qualities, but also love the imperfection.
I like that. Parenting, biggest parenting advice. If you were to sit down with someone who's about to have a child for the first time, what would you like to have been told before you had any of your children?
Enjoy every moment. You're not going to have a second opportunity to have a first child.
When you think about the next 5 to 10 years for you, where do you want to be then, Steph? How do you think about the kind of 5 to 10 year plan for you?
Well, I have a kick-ass side project you're going to hear about at some point. And then I'm sure I'll be working with some of the founders I'm working with today in 5 years and beyond that.
Steph, thank you so much for doing this. As I said, I heard so many great things from Fred for many years, so I'm thrilled we could do this, and it's been such a pleasure.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I still feel like an imposter here.